Well, so far this month we've talked about two different versions that are a bit lighter, more oriented towards children. Now we're going to talk about one that really tries hard to be the definitive version. So let's talk about how that turned out. Disney's A Christmas Carol. That's right. This is technically Disney's A Christmas Carol. Even though I don't really associate it with Disney, I usually associate it more with Robert Zemeckis because he did direct this. This was right off of the heels of Polar Express. And they took what they learned from that movie and refined it a bit, wanted to do another one in that style. Robert Zemeckis and a few other people had it in their mind that this was the future of film. This is how movies were going to be made going forward. And looking at movies today, we know that motion capture definitely has its place as a tool to be used, but it does have its limitations, and this movie definitely suffers from some of those. Mostly that uncanny valley of things looking very real and very human, but still that computer-generated puppetry that just feels a little off sometimes. Now, granted, this movie has fewer moments of that compared to the Polar Express. I feel like that movie was really the beta test for a lot of this technology. Thankfully, A Christmas Carol is not nearly as distracting in that regard, and it does have a very iconic Christmas Carol look to it. That's probably the thing that I love the most about this telling. I'd say about 90% of this movie feels like it was the book brought to the screen. The illustrations that we all grew up with Scrooge and the ghosts and the different representations that we've seen over the years, all harkening back to those iconic designs. That's all here. This movie has a very specific Dickens influence production design. The world of it feels very Dickens. You really do feel the love and care that Zemeckis and company had in crafting this version because they really wanted it to be the definitive version. And I've seen a lot of versions of The Christmas Carol. I've read the book multiple times, and I can say that there really is no definitive version. And I'd say about half the time, this movie really does succeed in giving us what's probably the closest thing to a definitive Christmas Carol. Aside from the designs and the world building, there's a lot of the book dialogue and book scenes in this version. There's a lot of scenes, too many to count, where they are just quoting the book, and more than just the typical memorable ones that we've heard a million times. No, when Fred, played by Colin Firth in this version, is giving his speech about Christmas being a kind, charitable time where people open up their shut-up hearts, you know, the speech that we've heard a million times, he doesn't give it in that abbreviated way that we've heard a million times. He does the full speech from the book. And there's a lot of moments like that where it goes that extra step to include lines that have been omitted in previous versions for the sake of adapting as faithfully as possible Dickens' words and dialogue onto the big screen. I really do appreciate that. And when the movie really sits in that pocket of being that iconic classic Christmas Carol, it's great. And a lot of the things that they do visually in this movie with the motion capture, the fact that it is all CGI, they can really put the camera wherever they want. It looks so impressive. This movie has some beautiful shots and cinematography here. The way that Robert Zemeckis composes these shots, especially in that first third before Jacob Marley's ghost shows up, are some of the best lit and best composed Christmas Carol shots I've ever seen. And when the ghosts do show up and Scrooge is whisked off to his adventure and he's seeing all these crazy things and being transported here, there, and everywhere, the cinematography doesn't get any less impressive. But there is something else that starts to kind of rear its ugly head in the adaptation department, and that's that this movie was clearly made for 3D. It was made in 2009 when the 3D craze was really popping off. So this movie does take advantage of the 3D a lot, and usually not in a super gimmicky way. It's actually done very well. It's incorporated well into the story where you can watch it on your TV at home and it doesn't distract you from anything, but when you see this in theater, it just looks even more incredible. Some of these shots just leap off the screen. For instance, when the Ghost of Christmas Present is showing Scrooge around town, he doesn't do it in the regular way from the book and in other versions where he's walking the city street with Scrooge and just kind of talking to him on the way. Here, we're still in Scrooge's parlor, I guess, where the Ghost of Christmas Present is sitting on top of his big mound of food and cakes and all that stuff. But the floor disappears and you see the city of London through the floor. So as they're kind of flying around, you see the room shake and turn and move, almost like we're in this Wonka Vader that's just flying around the city with a clear bottom. And that's just so original and really cool for 3D. But scenes like that, and later on with the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, where the Ghost of Christmas Future is chasing Scrooge down the streets with this phantom hearse with horses with red eyes. And it's an intense chase scene that really takes advantage of the 3D aspect of this movie. Does it really help to tell the story of A Christmas Carol? No, because that chase sequence is not in the book. There is something similar in the very beginning of the book where Scrooge is going up the stairs and he swears he sees a phantom hearse driving through the stairs, almost running him over. And this is actually one of the deleted scenes from the movie that was going to happen in the beginning to kind of set up the chase sequence at the end. And I feel like if it was left in the beginning, for one, it would be more faithful to the book, which again, if they're going for accuracy, that's something to keep in. But it would make this chase scene feel less just out of left field and maybe a little bit more justified, even though that whole chase is not in the book. It's something that they completely fabricated for the theatrical 3D experience to make it worth it, I guess, in the eyes of the people, which that is the one scene that I just can't justify. So watching this movie again, it clearly has two goals that are a little bit at odds with each other. Because on the one hand, they want to take advantage of this new 3D technology, really tell this story in an exciting and fresh way with the technology that they have. But at the same time, they're trying to present all this as the definitive Christmas Carol adaptation. And those two just don't go together, because the original Christmas Carol was not this 3D extravaganza with chase scenes and all that. So right away, the movie's a little confused. It doesn't really go all in on one or the other. You can't really have it both ways. Let's talk about the star of this movie, because it is Jim Carrey as Ebenezer Scrooge. And if you were to tell me that Jim Carrey was going to be Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, I would have some reservations myself, but to my surprise, Jim Carrey does a pretty good job as Scrooge. And I'm sure a lot of that is because of the book-accurate design of Scrooge. There is some influence clearly with Jim Carrey's facial features and all that. But you look at him and you just see Scrooge, which actually goes a long way. When you look at other versions of A Christmas Carol, like my personal favorite, the George C. Scott one, George C. Scott is a great Scrooge, but you still see George C. Scott as Scrooge. Here, you just see Scrooge. You don't really see Jim Carrey at all, which, given Jim Carrey's tendency to overact in roles, he's quite reined in as Scrooge, and he handles that cold, bitter, miserly Scrooge side really well, and it's actually pretty subtle and underplayed. However, Scrooge is not the only character that Jim Carrey plays in this movie. He also plays the different ghosts of Christmas past, present, and I guess future, but we don't really know because Ghost of Christmas Future doesn't have any lines. So really, I don't have much to say about that character. But past and present are also played by Jim Carrey. And I guess somebody, maybe Jim Carrey, maybe Robert Zemeckis, had this idea that they should all have different accents. That past was going to be this Irish living candle kind of guy. And the Ghost of Christmas Present was going to be what you'd think of with the Ghost of Christmas Present, just with a Scottish accent. And he actually reminds me of the Swamp King from Monty Python's Holy Grail. There's something about his accent and the red hair and the beard, and it just really reminds me of that. And it's not a bad thing, because I love the Ghost of Christmas Present in any telling. He's just such a cool guy to hang out with. He's really jovial and upbeat, but he's got this wisdom to him that really comes through later in his segment. And Jim Carrey does a fine job with that. It's really the Ghost of Christmas Past where I just don't understand the direction. Now, visually, I understand the temptation to make him a living candle, because there's a lot of cool things you can do visually with that candle to integrate him in different scenes, little scene transitions where he becomes a candle on a desk, for instance. But again, if the goal of this movie is to accurately depict the book as true as possible, this just is not the Ghost of Christmas Past from the book. Now, admittedly, the Ghost of Christmas Past is very difficult to pin down in a visual form. It's almost like some of these angel descriptions that you'll read in the Bible, where it's got multiple eyes, multiple heads. It's super bright, blinding even, and hard to make out, but there's details in there that are very specific. So adapting that, I do give these versions a bit of leeway, but here they really simplified it. They just did away with a lot of those details in the description. The flowers on his robe, the shoulder length hair, all that's really gone out the window, and he just looks like a candle with the extinguisher cap, which the movie does take full advantage of. So that's all well and good. It's different from the book, which isn't exactly a bad decision, except for these weird little moments where he kind of does this little dance for no apparent reason, and then his face changes to all the different people that Scrooge has seen in his past and quick succession, which actually is a holdover from the book. But again, if you're streamlining the design, you kind of have to streamline that too, because it just comes right out of left field. You don't know what's going on. And the weirdest part, at least for me, is this little tick that he has where it looks like he's trying to reignite his flame. He's kind of twitching his neck and there's sparks coming off. It's just weird, and it doesn't really contribute to anything. It's just these weird little choices that makes me think that, okay, maybe not every idea that Robert Zemeckis has is a good one. Maybe you just need some people to say, no, that's weird, let's just not do that. Speaking of which, something that does kind of rub me the wrong way about this version is just how incredibly dark it gets with the subject matter. Now, A Christmas Carol is a dark story, and I've already talked about in other versions how it seemed like they were trying to lighten it up, but with the Muppet one in particular, I feel like they struck a decent balance while still making it palatable for kids, but not watering it down too much. Here, they kind of go to the other extreme, where not only do they show all the different scenes and all the darker moments that are in the book, but they amplify them. They really let it sit, and they even expand on a few of them. And there are some moments sprinkled throughout where it just feels a little off, a little too dark, a little too mean-spirited for the story that it is, because even though Christmas Carol is a dark story, there's still a lot of lighter moments too to balance it out. But there's two scenes in particular that come to mind when I think of how this movie kind of crosses the line when it comes to indulging in the dark stuff. And for me, the big one is arguably the darkest scene in any version of A Christmas Carol. And no, it's not the Ghost of Christmas Future with all the death and grave stuff. For me, the darkest scene is the end of the Ghost of Christmas Past segment, when he's getting older and he lifts up his robe and you see Ignorance and Want, these two children that kind of look like Gollum. They're these emaciated, starving children. And the Ghost of Christmas Present issues Scrooge a warning about Ignorance and Want, in particular Ignorance, because on his forehead is marked doom. And it's this very ominous prophecy. And then when that message is fully accepted by Scrooge, the ghost disappears. And here we get kind of the same thing, but when Scrooge asks if there's any refuge or resource for these kids, typically the Ghost of Christmas Present would answer, are there no prisons, are there no workhouses? But here, the kids grow up with some kind of nightmarish imagery where this boy grows up, he's got a knife, and you see him become imprisoned, literalizing the prisons, and then you have the girl grow up to be what I'm guessing is a prostitute, the way she's dressed and the way she's moving around Scrooge, which prisons I get, but she's talking about workhouses, and I don't think Zemeckis knows what a workhouse is, because it's not that. It's not prostitution. That's a whole separate issue. Doesn't really line up, but again, this is Zemeckis really trying to drive home the message that, yeah, this is the dark Christmas Carol. We're taking it very seriously. We're making it the definitive version while not really understanding the source material fully. And then we get what may be the most nightmarish of all the imagery, the death of the Ghost of Christmas Present, which, okay, most of the time he just kind of disappears or he kind of ages out. Now here you actually see his skin wither away, it dissolves away, leaving a skeleton behind, and then the skeleton dissolves away, leaving just his robes, and then eventually nothing. And it's just Scrooge with the Ghost of Christmas Future coming up next. But all that really nightmarish imagery aside, I did see something really cool that was kind of a missed opportunity in this version that they could have done. And it's if you're gonna show the aging and deterioration of the Ghost of Christmas Present, wouldn't it be an interesting idea, if you're gonna take some liberties visually anyway with the source material, to make the Ghost of Christmas Present and the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come the same entity, but in a different state. And the first time I thought about this, I was like, no, Colby, that's crazy. They're two separate entities. They have two separate domains. But in this version, when you see him become a skeleton, the first thing I thought of was, oh, he's morphing into the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. And I could totally see this happening, where his robes get darker and the hood flips up and his face kind of dissolves away, and now it's just this shadowy skeletal form that's the Ghost of Christmas Future. And even narratively, I think this idea could work, because the Ghost of Christmas Present does see a little bit of the future in his time with Scrooge. A lot of people forget that when it's revealed that Tiny Tim will die and that there's a crutch without an owner by the fireplace, that's not the Ghost of Christmas Future. That's the Ghost of Christmas Present, kind of looking ahead ever so slightly, which might be a plot hole in the original text. But if they are the same entity, just at two different stages, it does make sense that the Ghost of Christmas Past could see a little bit of that. But this movie didn't even take advantage of that. It just wanted dark and creepy imagery for the sake of it. And the other moment in this movie that really stands out is with Marley's ghost. And Marley's ghost is, you know, what you would expect from any other version. There's not really a lot to talk about here, except for the moment when his jaw falls off. And that just also didn't need to be in there. There is something in the book about his jaw being shut up with this wrap, which was customary for dead people back in the day. And he unwraps it in the beginning to let his jaw hang down so he can talk to Scrooge. But this doesn't even happen then. It happens in the middle of their conversation. And he does this weird thing where he's still talking even though his jaw isn't really behaving. And it goes from being this dark, nightmarish moment to kind of comedic when he's talking about the woes of his past life, and just the tones don't go together. You can either have this scene be dark and foreboding and ominous like a lot of the stage versions have, or you can have it be a little comedic like the goofier Muppet versions, or you can have it be a straight up horror show, but you can't have all three going on. That just doesn't work. But there are a lot of good things in this version, especially with the supporting cast. The supporting cast is phenomenal, and I mean phenomenal. They are all incredibly talented actors. You have Colin Firth as Fred, who I already kind of mentioned, but he does a great job bringing that joyousness to Fred, that optimism, and even that warmth, forgiveness towards the end of the movie when Scrooge does show up for dinner. It's just fantastic. Bob Hoskins as Fezziwig is just perfect casting through and through. But the real standout in this movie is Gary Oldman as Bob Cratchit, because Bob Cratchit has always been the heart and soul of A Christmas Carol. Him and his family, Tiny Tim, who actually doesn't get that many lines in this version, and that's probably for the best, because usually when they overplay Tiny Tim, it gets a little preachy. Tiny Tim feels a little too insufferable as this perfect child. But here, they get a decent balance, and a lot of that's communicated not through Tiny Tim, but through Bob Cratchit and his wife. But the moment that really sold me on Gary Oldman's performance is when he's going up the stairs to grieve Tiny Tim. And because Scrooge is invisible, Cratchit thinks he's alone, and he just lets out this face of just pure grief and sadness, and it is so heartbreaking to see. Even if it is brought to life in that uncanny valley kind of way, the emotion is so potent in that moment that I'm like, okay, this is a really good scene. This is a really good moment with Bob Cratchit that actually does elevate the whole movie for me, in my opinion. And even though this movie does take a few liberties with the ghosts and the supernatural element, everything in London with the supporting cast, with the characters bouncing off of each other, it does feel like the closest thing we've ever gotten to a definitive version of A Christmas Carol. I just personally wish that that sentiment was carried out throughout the entire runtime. But in a world where there's a million different versions of A Christmas Carol out there, you can kind of pick your poison, and there are some scenes in this movie that are some of the best delivered, best realized scenes of any Christmas Carol. But then there's other stuff that just feels a little too indulgent, a little too dark, and just a little too tonally inconsistent for my liking. So all in all, this version's a pretty mixed bag, but I do like it more than I don't like it, if that makes any sense. It is a good version. It's a version I'll pop on every so often to get in that Christmas mood. But now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Disney's A Christmas Carol? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.